It was a perfect day, or so it seemed. The late afternoon sun poured its golden light through the tall windows of the grand ballroom, casting a warm glow over rows of elegantly dressed guests. Laughter and chatter filled the air as friends and family gathered to celebrate the union of two people deeply in love. The bride, radiant in a custom gown, glided down the aisle, her every step a reflection of grace and hope. Her smile lit up the room, her dark skin glowing as if kissed by the light itself. She was beautiful, confident, and undeniably captivating. Beside her stood her groom, a man she believed was her soulmate, dressed sharply in a tailored suit, his expression unreadable as the ceremony unfolded. Their love story had been one of perseverance and passion. Against all odds, they had overcome countless challenges: skepticism from friends, disapproving murmurs from distant relatives, and the everyday trials that test the strength of a relationship. Together, they had always found their way back to each other, promising that their bond would stand strong no matter what life threw at them. Today was supposed to be the ultimate affirmation of that promise. But as the day wore on, cracks began to appear in the perfect picture. The reception was where it all started. Guests toasted the newlyweds, clinking glasses and sharing heartfelt speeches that brought both tears and laughter. The music played and couples filled the dance floor. At first, everything seemed magical. But then subtle signs of tension began to emerge between the bride and groom. Their smiles didn't quite reach their eyes. Their conversations were clipped, filled with forced laughter. To the casual observer, it might have gone unnoticed, but to those who knew them well, something was amiss. It happened during the cake cutting, a moment meant to symbolize sweetness and unity. The bride, laughing nervously, playfully dabbed a bit of frosting on the groom's nose. The guests erupted in laughter, expecting him to return the playful gesture. Instead, his smile faltered. His hand tensed around the glass of champagne he was holding, and before anyone could register what was happening, he hurled it at her. The sound of glass shattering against the floor echoed through the room, silencing the laughter. Guests rippled through the crowd as the bride froze, her face a mix of shock and disbelief. Time seemed to stand still. Every pair of eyes darted between the couple, trying to make sense of what had just occurred. The groom's face was pale, his expression unreadable. The bride, trembling, looked down at the fragments of glass near her feet, then back at the man she had just vowed to spend the rest of her life with. For a moment, no one moved. It was as if the air had been sucked out of the room, leaving a vacuum of uncertainty and confusion. And then slowly the murmurs began. Guests whispered to each other, exchanging looks of horror and concern. The bride's best friend rushed to her side, while others hovered uncertainly, unsure whether to intervene or let the couple resolve whatever had just unfolded. The groom's parents looked mortified, their faces flushed with embarrassment. The bride's family sat stiffly, their expressions a mix of anger and heartbreak. In the midst of it all, the bride stood tall, her composure remarkable despite the circumstances. She looked at her groom, her eyes filled with a mix of hurt and resolve. Whatever had just happened, it was clear that this moment would forever change the course of their lives. But what could drive someone to such an outburst on what was supposed to be the happiest day of their life? What unspoken tensions or buried emotions had surfaced in that moment? As the room buzzed with speculation, the bride's next move would leave everyone speechless and set the stage for a chain of events no one could have anticipated. This was no ordinary wedding, and what followed after that shocking moment would keep everyone talking for years to come. The silence in the room was unbearable, and yet no one dared to break it. The bride, her hands trembling slightly, bent down to pick up a piece of the shattered glass. Her fingers brushed the floor for just a moment before her best friend gently pulled her back up, whispering something no one could hear. The groom stood frozen, his face contorted in an expression that teetered between regret and defiance. The weight of every eye in the room bore down on him, yet he refused to move or speak. The bride finally stood straight, her shoulders squared as if drawing strength from deep within. She locked eyes with the groom, her voice steady despite the tremor that betrayed her hurt. "Why?" she asked softly, the single word cutting through the room like a blade. It wasn't a question of anger, it was a plea for understanding, an effort to find reason in the chaos of the moment. But he didn't answer. He couldn't. As the murmurs grew louder, the wedding planner discreetly signaled to the DJ to start the music again, hoping to smooth over the tension. But no one returned to the dance floor. Instead, clusters of guests huddled together, their whispers weaving a web of speculation. Some wondered if it had been a moment of drunken recklessness. Others speculated about deeper issues, jealousy, unresolved arguments, or secrets that might have bubbled to the surface under the pressure of the day. To understand what led to this shocking moment, we need to go back to when the bride and groom first met. Their story began 2 years earlier at a mutual friend's engagement party. She was there reluctantly, dragged along by her best friend who insisted she needed to get out more. He was there by chance, filling in for his brother, who had a last-minute work emergency. They had both been outsiders at the event, lingering on the edges of the crowd. When their paths crossed, there was an instant connection. She loved his dry sense of humor, the way he could make her laugh even when she didn't want to. He was drawn to her strength, her independence, and the way she seemed to light up every room she entered. Their relationship blossomed quickly, but not without its challenges. There were cultural differences, family expectations, and societal pressures that weighed heavily on them. And yet, through it all, they had stayed together, believing their love could overcome anything. But as they prepared for their wedding, cracks had begun to show. The bride had confided in her best friend just weeks before the ceremony that she felt the groom was distant. "It's like he's pulling away," she'd said, her voice filled with both sadness and frustration. The groom, on the other hand, had been vocal to his brother about feeling overwhelmed. "This wedding isn't just about us," he had complained. "It's about pleasing everyone else. I feel like I'm losing control." Their differences in handling stress became more pronounced as the wedding day approached. She threw herself into planning, determined to make every detail perfect. He grew increasingly withdrawn, resentful of the mounting expectations. By the time the wedding day arrived, they were both exhausted, emotionally and mentally. Yet they had hoped the ceremony would be a fresh start, a chance to refocus on the love that had brought them together in the first place. As the night progressed, small tensions between them began to flare. A missed cue during the first dance, an awkward moment during the speeches. It all added up, fueling an undercurrent of unease. The champagne glass was the breaking point, but it wasn't the cause. It was the culmination of weeks, maybe even months, of unspoken frustrations and unresolved issues. Now, standing in the aftermath of the incident, both the bride and groom were grappling with their emotions. For the bride, it was a mix of humiliation, hurt, and a fierce determination not to crumble in front of everyone. For the groom, it was guilt tangled with defensiveness, the weight of his actions pressing heavily on him. And then, just as the tension reached its peak, someone stepped forward. It was the bride's father, a quiet man who rarely spoke in public, but whose presence commanded respect. He walked slowly to his daughter, placing a protective hand on her shoulder before turning to the groom. His voice was calm but firm as he said, "Whatever is happening here, it needs to be addressed now. Not later, not behind closed doors. Right now." The room held its breath, every guest leaning in, waiting to see what would happen next. The groom's jaw tightened, and for a moment, It seemed as though he might walk away. But then he spoke, his voice low and uneven. "You don't understand," he said, his eyes darting around the room before finally landing on the bride. "This isn't what it looks like." The bride's father didn't waver. "Then explain it," he said simply. And in that moment, everyone in the room knew they were on the edge of something much bigger. Whatever was about to unfold would either shatter the fragile foundation of this marriage or rebuild it stronger than ever. The air was thick with suspense, every heartbeat sensed to the anticipation of what was to come. The room was so quiet that the faint hum of the air conditioning seemed deafening. All eyes were on the groom as he stood there, his shoulders slumped under the weight of what felt like judgment from every corner. The bride, though visibly shaken, kept her gaze steady on him, waiting, like everyone else, for him to explain. For a long moment, he didn't say a word, his silence only deepening the tension. Then finally, he took a deep breath and spoke. "I didn't mean to ruin today," he began, his voice barely audible. "I didn't mean to hurt you." His eyes flicked to the bride, and the pain in his expression was unmistakable. "But I couldn't hold it in anymore. This day, this whole thing, has felt like I've been suffocating. Not because of you," he added quickly, his voice breaking, "but because I've been carrying something I didn't know how to tell you." The bride's brows furrowed, confusion flickering across her face. "What are you talking about?" she asked, her voice softer now, laced with a mix of anger and worry. He hesitated again, his hands trembling slightly. "There's been so much pressure, so much expectation. I didn't want to disappoint you, or my family, or anyone. But I've been struggling, and instead of talking to you about it, I let it fester." He looked down at the floor, ashamed. "I'm scared, okay. Scared that I'm not enough. Scared that I can't live up to what you deserve." The bride blinked, the weight of his words sinking in. For a moment, her anger gave way to something softer. She took a step closer to him, her voice steady but kind. "Why didn't you just tell me that?" she asked. "I'm not perfect either. I've been so focused on making everything perfect for this wedding that I didn't see you were struggling. But we're supposed to be a team. You don't have to carry everything alone." Her words seemed to pierce through the fog of guilt that had clouded his mind. He nodded, swallowing hard. "I know," he said. "I know that now. But I let my pride and my fear get in the way. And then today, when things started to feel overwhelming, I just snapped. I'm so sorry. I know I've embarrassed you, hurt you. I don't expect forgiveness, but I need you to know it wasn't about you." The room was still, every guest hanging on their words. The bride's father, still standing nearby, stepped back, allowing the couple the space they needed. The bride took a deep breath, her own emotions a whirlwind of hurt, relief, and hope. "I won't lie," she said. "What you did hurt me. It humiliated me. But what matters more is that we face this together. If we can be honest with each other, we can get through anything." The groom looked at her, his eyes glistening. "I don't deserve you," he whispered. "But I promise, from this moment on, I'll do better. I'll be better." The bride hesitated for only a second before stepping closer and taking his hand. "We both need to be better," she said. "This isn't just on you. But if we're going to make this work, it has to start with honesty." A wave of relief seemed to wash over the room as the bride and groom embraced. The guests began to clap hesitantly at first, then with more enthusiasm. The tension that had gripped the ballroom began to dissipate, replaced by a cautious optimism. The bride's best friend wiped away a tear, while the groom's brother gave him a subtle nod of approval from across the room. As the music resumed and the shattered glass was cleaned up, the couple shared a quiet moment together, away from the crowd. "This day didn't go how I imagined," The bride said with a small smile. But maybe that's okay. Maybe it's better that we're starting off knowing we've got some work to do. The groom nodded. I'll spend the rest of my life making it up to you. They returned to the reception, hand in hand, ready to face the future together. The rest of the evening was far from perfect. There were still awkward glances and whispered conversations, but it no longer mattered. What mattered was that they had taken the first step toward healing, and they were determined to face whatever came next together. As the night drew to a close, guests left with plenty to talk about, but also with a sense of having witnessed something real. Love isn't always flawless. It's messy, complicated, and sometimes painful. But it's also about resilience, forgiveness, and the willingness to grow together. For the bride and groom, this wasn't the fairy tale they had planned, but it was the beginning of a story worth telling, a story of second chances, of finding strength in vulnerability, and of love that endures even when it's tested.